Okay, let's get started, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Jess Peake. I'm the Director of the International and Comparative Law Program here at the Law School. This event is sponsored by both the International and Comparative Law Program and the Burkle Centre on International Relations, and I'm glad to see we have a mixed audience here. I'm just going to give a very, very brief introduction to our speaker. He will then speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, which will leave about 30 minutes for questions. So please, feel free to ask him about the myriad of projects that Independent Diplomat is working on at the moment. Our speaker today is Carne Ross, who resigned from the British Foreign Service after giving secret evidence to an official inquiry into the use of intelligence before the 2003 Iraq invasion. He then founded and now runs Independent Diplomat, which is a non-profit advisory group that assists democratic countries and political groups with diplomatic strategy, including, among others, the moderate Syrian opposition, the Frente Polisario of the Western Sahara, and the Marshall Islands, whom Independent Diplomat advises on negotiations for new UN climate treaty. Carne is also a writer and commentator on world affairs. His most recent book, The Leaderless Revolution, argues that governments are failing to solve our most urgent problems, and proposes that gentle anarchism may be the most effective method of political change in the 21st century. A documentary film about Carne and his ideas, The Accidental Anarchist, is currently in production with backing from various international broadcasters. And with that, I will hand it over to Carne. Thanks.
Thanks, Jess. Always good to announce oneself as an anarchist in the law school. Greetings. Thanks for having me. I'm going to talk pretty swiftly. If there's anything that isn't clear about what I say, do please interrupt me. We're a small group, so it's very informal. Don't feel you need to stand on ceremony or ask me a question afterwards. And I look forward to a discussion with you. What I'm going to do is talk about 5 little things very quickly. First of all, a history of Independent Diplomat, how I got to be doing what we're doing. Secondly, some examples of the use of international law in our projects. I'll give 3 examples, looking at Syria, Sri Lanka, and the climate treaty. Thirdly, I'll make some broad and provocative points about the role of international law in the resolution of conflict and in some of these issues that I've worked on. Fourthly, I'll make a point about norms and law. And fifthly, a general and rather grandiose point about the world order and where we're heading. So let me start with the microcosmic, the small facts of one's life. I was a British diplomat for 15 years. From 1989, I did various jobs around the world. Afghanistan, I was a speechwriter. I did the Middle East peace process when it was still called that. I served in Bonn, in Norway, Kabul, and in the British mission to the United Nations in New York, where I served from 1998 to 2002. Where I was head of the Middle East section, primarily dealing with Iraq, but also dealing with Israel, Palestine, the Western Sahara, the Lockerbie case and getting the 2 Lockerbie accused to a trial in The Hague, and various other bits of the Middle East. And after 9/11, I got given, in addition to Iraq, terrorism in Afghanistan. So I had all the fun, easy issues. Anyway, that history might also give you a hint as to why I'm no longer a British diplomat. In 2004, those of us who worked on Iraq were asked if we wanted to give evidence to the first official inquiry into the Iraq war, which was looking at the use of intelligence in the decision-making before the war. I decided to give evidence to that inquiry. I decided to do so in secret because I was then still a British diplomat. I was on secondment to the United Nations in Kosovo, which is also part of this story. But I didn't want to lose my job, and I wanted to have my career as a diplomat. And so I gave my evidence in secret. But after I gave my evidence, which was, as you might imagine, very critical of my government, because I worked very intensively on weapons of mass destruction, weapons inspections, and the law of what we were doing in Iraq. I was our so-called Iraq expert, and I'd worked on it longer than almost anybody in the British government. After I gave my evidence, I realised that I could not go back to London, to the Foreign Office, and work for the very people who had executed this travesty. So I resigned, and this was 2004. As I said, I was in Kosovo, and it was in fact Kosovo that gave me the inspiration for what became Independent Diplomat. Kosovo was then of indeterminate status. it had been liberated from Yugoslav Serbian domination by the NATO intervention in 1999, but it had not had any formal status in the international system, and its status was undetermined. And this state of having no status created a lot of political tension in Kosovo, and culminated in riots in 2004, which killed 18 people, which I saw and was part of, not as a perpetrator, but as a witness. And when I left Independent Diplomat, I looked back at my diplomatic career and I looked at what had happened in Kosovo, and I began to see some connections between sitting in the UN Security Council, discussing Iraq, Palestine, Kosovo, Afghanistan, where invariably the one group of people who guaranteed would not be in that discussion were Iraqis, Palestinians, Kosovars, Afghans, and this dawned on me in retrospect that this wasn't very sensible. And in Kosovo, Kosovo was expressly prohibited from having any diplomatic service, any representation, and was nevertheless the subject of a very secretive diplomatic process led by a 6-country contact group, which was supposed to be deciding what would happen to Kosovo and would ultimately decide Kosovo's final status. And that separation of Kosovo from the discussions about its own future was a very clear factor in the violence that I witnessed. It wasn't the only factor, but that frustration of being excluded from discussion of their own future was very evident to me in the smoke rising from burned out churches, from people being stoned to death on the streets around me. So I saw this connection between political violence and diplomatic exclusion. And so rather lost after abandoning a career I thought would be my life, I decided to advise the Kosovo government on the diplomacy about Kosovo. I knew all the Kosovo political leaders. I'd been a senior advisor at the UN mission in Kosovo. And when I quit from the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, I had to leave the mission immediately because I was seconded by the British government. I had to walk out of my office the moment I did it. And I came back 2 weeks later and had lunch with dinner with the Prime Minister, and offered to advise him on Kosovo's diplomacy, and that was the beginning of Independent Diplomat. And for several years, until Kosovo became independent in 2007, I and later my colleagues and I advised Kosovo on the rather intricate and secret diplomatic discussion that culminated in Kosovo declaring its independence. Although it wasn't recognised by the United Nations Security Council, which was nominally in charge of that process, Kosovo is now recognised by something like 120 countries. And that was the first project of Independent Diplomat. And slowly, various people came to join me. We established ourselves as a charity, then in the US as a non-profit. Today we have about 6 offices around the world, in New York, London, Brussels, Somaliland, Hargeisa, in Sydney, where one of my colleagues lives, to be close to the South Pacific, where one of our clients is located, and a couple of other places. Today we advise various democratic groups and governments and countries on diplomatic strategy. They qualify for our help because they are excluded in some way from the diplomatic process that concerns their future. So we advise, as Jess mentioned, the moderate Syrian opposition, the Syrian National Coalition. We advise the PLO, we advise the Frente Polisario, who represent the people of the Western Sahara. We advise the Marshall Islands on the Paris Treaty, which is about to be negotiated. Well, it's been negotiated for many years, but it's about to be agreed, one assumes. Who else? We've advised Kosovo, Moldova, we advised Croatia on its EU accession, etc., etc. I won't run through a full list. So that's what I do. Nobody else does what we do, so we're kind of making it up as we go along. It's very interesting. It's given me extraordinary insights into diplomacy, which, as a British diplomat, I thought I had privileged access to the diplomatic system, which I did in a kind of way, but now I have a different kind of privilege, which is actually sitting with the people who are subject to these diplomatic processes and learning what they think about it and seeing a little bit what it's like to be marginalised and politically ignored, a little bit what it's like to be a party like the Frente Polisario, which represents the people of the Western Sahara, but who are denied their rights in a wholesale manner. Anyway, let me talk about 3 quick examples of international law in what we do. We have a theory of change in independent diplomat, which is good diplomacy is made up of 3 elements: political strategy, public diplomacy, which is kind of PR for countries, and international law. And we have experts in all those 3 areas, and we try to blend this advice together into one piece of strategy for our clients, who invariably, because they're small, they have, some of them are just one foreign minister with a broken desk and a computer that doesn't work. We try to make it as simple as possible for them to execute. Anyway, international law in our projects. Of course, one of the ones that's most on people's minds at the moment is Syria. We have advised the Syrian National Coalition since quite early on after the revolution. They are the umbrella group of moderate opposition groups, mostly exiles. They're based in Istanbul. They're loosely associated with the Free Syrian Army on the ground. The legal issues, international legal issues there are of course manifold. I'll pick out 2. One is accountability, where of course accountability for the war crimes that have been perpetrated in Syria is a big objective of the opposition. Unfortunately, accountability has been more or less completely blocked at the international level. The Security Council has refused to refer the Syrian situation to the International Criminal Court. The Human Rights Council has made various kind of vague announcements about Syria, which in some ways rhetorically are quite strong, but haven't led to any real process. They've led to a commission of inquiry into Syria, but nothing that plausibly will lead to actual process, criminal process against those responsible for war crimes. They may in due course. One particularly egregious case is that the Assad regime used chemical weapons against its own people in a suburb of Damascus 2 summers ago, I think it was now, and Russia blocked the UN even identifying the regime as the perpetrator in those attacks, let alone pursuing accountability for those barbaric attacks. A second issue that we're particularly focusing on now, given what's happening at the moment in Syria, is protection of civilians. I have to say we're not really pursuing this through international law at the moment. We are vigorously advocating for what we call a no-bombing zone in Syria. Our clients, the Syrian opposition, tell us emphatically that this is the #1 issue for them, stopping civilians being killed, because they've been killed in large numbers by the regime primarily. The regime continues to kill far more people than ISIS or any other actor in Syria, mostly through the use of these dreadful barrel bombs. And a no-bombing zone, I can't frankly, given the political dispensation in the UN Security Council and the geopolitics around Syria at the moment, I can't see that being legally authorized by the Security Council were various countries to decide to implement it. Another issue we have worked on a great deal is Sri Lanka, which was the most recent case of mass war crimes, the worst case of mass war crimes since Rwanda, where there has been a long argument in the Human Rights Council about accountability for the war crimes that took place. And in September, there was a remarkable resolution of the Human Rights Council, a body about which I have many views, but this was a good day for the Human Rights Council, where they agreed and they endorsed a report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which had found, amongst many other things, that there should be an international hybrid international tribunal to investigate and try war crimes in Sri Lanka. This was an enormous step forward in the cause of accountability in Sri Lanka, and one that frankly I never expected to see, given the geopolitics around Sri Lanka, where very few countries were willing to stand out and criticize the Sri Lankan government, both in its previous iteration under the Rajapaksa brothers, who were kind of authoritarian, but also, interestingly, particularly under the recently elected President Sirisena, who was more moderate. And there you get the geopolitical force of people wanting to give a moderate government a chance, rather than exerting international pressure on them to do the right thing. And that dialogue, that international discussion will continue, but some important markers have been put down for justice in Sri Lanka for the war crimes, the terrible war crimes that took place, and the possibility of there being some kind of international hybrid tribunal has, I think, taken a significant step forward. The third international law aspect of our projects that I'll mention is climate, which is another extraordinary case, extraordinary in the sense that what is being negotiated for agreement in Paris is completely unprecedented and is arguably one of the most important international treaties that will be agreed in our lifetimes. Who knows, but is of obviously epic global importance. And it's a long story, which some of you may know, but we have advised the Marshall Islands, which is one of the most vulnerable countries to sea level rise, where the foreign minister, I saw him a couple of weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, was telling me that his own garden is being flooded on a regular basis now by rising ocean levels. And they are suffering unprecedented levels of typhoons, flooding and salination of their water supplies. So this is not a future phenomenon for them, it's an actual experience now for them, the damage caused by climate change. So it's very, very moving and striking to be with the leaders of the Marshall Islands as they go round international diplomatic forums trying to convince the world to have a rigorous treaty which will have meaningful emissions targets, amongst other things, because of course the Paris Treaty will cover a whole host of different issues, including compensation for mitigation measures and compensation for damage, which is rising up the agenda as an issue as the damage becomes clearer and clearer. But the legal aspects of it are, of course, particularly germane here in the US, because I'm afraid the legal form of that treaty is in many ways being determined by the political limits of Congress. The treaty will not be a legally binding treaty, and that is because President Obama cannot get a legally binding treaty through Congress in its current iteration. It will have binding elements of it, including binding obligations to measure, verify, what's the other word? MRV, MVR, I can't remember. There's another word, R. I wrote it down. I didn't. But anyway, there's three elements of the treaty which are legally binding, unlike the overall treaty. And so that political limitation is determining the legal form of the treaty. There are nonetheless interesting things, extraordinarily interesting things about the treaty. One of the most pertinent issues currently being negotiated, which I'm proud to say we innovated around the table in New York, is the idea that countries should come back to the treaty body with new emissions targets on a regular basis. When the treaty was first mooted, this period of reporting, the reporting period, was mooted as 10 years. And the Marshall Islands and we have been advocating for a much shorter reporting period, that it should be 5 years when countries come back to the treaty body to report their new mitigation, their new carbon emissions targets. And the reason why that's a powerful ratchet for progress in climate is because already it has been agreed that future carbon emissions targets cannot be less than the ones they have already made. So there's this kind of ratchet effect that the more often you're required to report your carbon emissions targets to the rest of the world, the greater pressure on you to improve those targets at each occasion, if that logic is clear. I haven't explained it terribly clearly, but I think you know what I mean. You will have seen regularly reported over the last several weeks the emissions targets announced by various big countries and small countries. India, I think, was fairly recent. China was about a month ago. Very, very significant moments in climate diplomacy when these national targets are announced. What is already, however, scientifically clear is that in scientific terms, the aggregate of these emission targets will not be enough, that they will not be enough to keep us to this nominal 2 degrees centigrade rise in temperature target, which is of course disquieting, to put it mildly. Moreover, the non-binding nature of the treaty is itself a worry in that countries that choose to ignore their emissions targets or the regulatory mechanisms of the treaty will not be penalised. There will be no way other than the kind of political embarrassment and shaming to hold them to their obligations. And we saw an example of that when Canada walked out of the predecessor treaty to Paris, the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Treaty as it was called. Canada, I think a year or so ago, decided to abandon its obligations under UNFCCC without consequence whatsoever. There is an interesting case study about the potential and limits of international law in dealing with an epic global problem like climate change. I can't do justice to the complexity and importance of the issues in a very brief survey like this, but I find it extraordinarily interesting watching a system that was essentially designed in the 20th century of nation states trying to agree a treaty which all of them, all 193 of them, agree to deal with a problem of such concern to humanity as climate change. I think is a really interesting example of a system being used for a purpose for which it was not intended, and whether that system is therefore adequate is, I think, a very open question. And those of us who think about these things, I think, need to think about them very critically and thoughtfully, because the answer, at least to me, is not clear. I argue about this in Independent Diplomat a lot because I'm a kind of radical about it. And I believe that actually countries like the Marshall Islands should be very loudly saying this is not enough, and that they should actually refuse to sign Paris as a result. I've not won that argument. The Marshallese, whose choice it is, I'm glad to say, not mine, and my colleagues who advise them say that this is a start. This is something, and we can ratchet up the obligations within it. But also, most importantly, they say this is a framework in which national policy and investment decisions and business decisions will then be made. And I think that's quite a persuasive argument, rather than the free-for-all, which I might argue as an alternative, not very plausibly. Anyway, as you can hear from those examples, with the exception of climate, most of what we do in Independent Diplomat is conflict-related. That's partly because I'm just looking at the time, not checking my emails. Partly because that's my background. I dealt with a lot of conflict when I was at the Foreign Office. For some reason, I gravitated towards it. And I think I want to make a general suggestion to you about the nature of international law in conflict, which is deliberately designed to provoke, and I will put it in stark terms to you, which is that basically international law will always be subordinate to the geopolitics of any situation. And that is not something I say with joy, but it is something I've witnessed on multiple occasions. To give you an example, we advised the Frente Polisario of the Western Sahara. The Western Sahara was occupied by Morocco in 1975. In 1991, Morocco and the Frente Polisario agreed a ceasefire to the war that had been taking place since 1975, under which Morocco agreed to hold a referendum on self-determination for the territory. The International Court of Justice in the same year, about 40 years ago this week, gave a decision saying the status of the territory needed to be determined. And the UN Security Council, in repeated resolutions under Chapter 7 of the Charter obligatory, stated that there needed to be a referendum on self-determination of the Western Sahara. The legal case could not be stronger, and yet that referendum has never happened. Meanwhile, back in Kosovo, which we also advised, Kosovo once, I'll tell you a little anecdote, there are various NGOs which, like us, giving advice on diplomatic strategy, give advice on legal matters to countries like Kosovo or some of our clients in other disputes. And they, an American NGO, advised the Kosovars that they should put out a document stating the legal case for Kosovo to be independent. The Kosovars gave us this document and said, what do you think? And we looked at it and said, under no circumstances deliver that document to anybody, because your legal case is pathetically weak. You basically have no legal case for independence. What you have is a political case, which is that you have been governed separately from Serbia since 1999. You have effectively governed yourself. And the overwhelming majority of your people, were they to be asked, would want independence. These are political, not legal arguments. And those were the arguments that Kosovo then ended up making. Today, Kosovo is independent, was independent from 2007. It is not independent because political arguments always supervene legal arguments. It is independent, and the Western Sahara has not had a referendum on self-determination for one reason alone, which is the powerful countries of the world, in particular the United States, decided of their own accord and in discussion with other powerful countries that Kosovo should be independent. That was the determinative decision. It was nothing to do with international law. And in the Western Sahara, whilst the US and other countries, and I'm not picking out the US, the Europeans have been much worse on the Western Sahara than the US. Whilst the US and the EU and others pay lip service to the obligations of international law, they have done precisely nothing to make Morocco hold this referendum, which they are legally obliged to do. And as a result, the people of the Western Sahara, many of them still live in refugee camps, in tents literally in the middle of the Sahara Desert. I make that example as a stark contrast between the force of geopolitics and the force of international law. One that, of course, is also close to my heart is the Iraq War, where I personally negotiated many of the resolutions on weapons inspections and sanctions that preceded the war, and there is absolutely no question in my mind that that war was illegal, and yet it took place and was perpetrated by two permanent members of the UN Security Council who claimed legal justification for it, one with more need than the other, if I can put it like that. The Brits needed more of a legal argument than the Americans cared about. But nonetheless, the fact that the most egregious act by states in invading another state, the very thing that international law and the UN Charter was designed to prevent, because one can argue that the UN Charter is inappropriate for many of the conflicts that we see today, which are intra-state conflicts, which do not involve state parties. But the Charter was written to stop state-to-state conflict. And that Charter was ignored by two permanent members of the UN Security Council, both of whom pride themselves on being democratic and law-abiding. Anyway, the fourth point I want to make is to say that nonetheless, I have been impressed by the normative power of certain principles of international law. And rather than being enforced as laws in a rules-based system where there are meaningful enforcement mechanisms, I'm struck by the fact that these norms have become promoted and have become part of the international diplomatic discourse in a way that has promoted the objectives for which they were originally drafted. The classic example, of course, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not an enforceable treaty, but it has probably more impact in terms of changing the discourse of international relations and the way in which states are supposed to treat their peoples than almost any other document, probably more than any other document. I know the American Constitution in this country is seen as having a similar role, but in international terms, the Universal Declaration probably is primus inter pares. A less well-known concept that has been advanced in recent years is that of protection of civilians. I mentioned this in the context of Syria. The mere fact that we can talk about protection of civilians in Syria is a new thing. 15 years ago we couldn't use that phrase and it had force and meaning. POC, it's known in UN circles. It was reiterated in a slightly broader and more elaborate and therefore more confusing form in the form of responsibility to protect, R2P, which was then endorsed by the 2005 Millennium Summit, I think it was, but also not a legal concept. Protection of civilians, although endorsed in various Security Council resolutions, again is a normative rather than a legally enforceable concept. But the idea basically being that states have an obligation not to kill their own people, and if states are killing their own people, that creates an obligation on other states to do something about it. And the reason I think this is interesting is because even though the Security Council is completely stymied in dealing with Syria, POC, protection of civilians, is an issue. It's a constant kind of drumbeat of the way diplomats talk about Syria, which I think, it's not progress, and if you're being bombed by a Syrian helicopter, I expect it means damn all to you, and it would be damn all to me in the same situation, but I find that significant. In the case of Libya, protection of civilians and R2P itself ultimately became iterated in the form of Chapter 7 resolutions passed by the Security Council, which we could then use to authorize force, in theory, for the protection of civilians, what became a NATO intervention in Libya. But then Russia said, well, you weren't just protecting civilians, you were obviously doing regime change, you obviously were just trying to get rid of Gaddafi, which has actually coloured to some extent, at least in the little bubble of the UN Security Council, has coloured these words, protection of civilians, and it has certainly done great damage in the UN Security Council to the concept of R2P. Not that the supporters of R2P want to hear that, but it has. As has the Iraq War, but that's another story. Anyway, I just wanted to draw attention to those, you know, in all my cynicism about the laws of war and international law in conflict. I am struck by the importance of these normative concepts. And this has kind of led me, it's one of the things that has led me to a kind of view of the world, if I can pompously put it like that, which some describe as anarchism, and when I want to be kind of spicy and provocative, I would too. Which is that the vision of the world as a rules-based order, which was a vision that animated liberal states and statespeople in the post-Second World War era, but also before Second World War, Woodrow Wilson. This idea, I think, is increasingly irrelevant in the world that we see today. I don't say that with happiness. I would love it that right-thinking nations would create some kind of Kantian order, as he wrote in Eternal Peace, where democracies, republics as he described them, lock themselves together in eternal peace through agreements between them in a sort of almost like a pyramid. Or in the UN, it's a kind of neatly geometric globe. It's a very tempting image aesthetically of how we think the world should be run. But having sat on the UN Security Council and dealing with the Western Sahara, Kosovo, or wherever, and also actually having just come back from Syria, where I literally looked at ISIS 2 miles away from Kurdish front lines in eastern Syria, it is hard to believe that a rules-based order is what we are looking at. We are looking at something rather more chaotic, certainly something more complicated. And it may be that the vision of a rules-based order actually may be counterproductive in this context. And I'll take Syria as an example. Today the news is full of Assad going to Moscow to meet Putin. Putin and the Russians, as well as bombing liberally in Syria, are talking about reinvigorating a political process to end the war in Syria. And the administration, the White House, is saying, yes, we want a political process, but we don't believe that bombing rebels on the ground is the way to achieve it. And it has long been a kind of trope of Syria diplomacy that until you get the Russians, Americans, Saudis, Iranians and Turks to agree, there will be no peace in Syria. And I remember Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN Special Envoy for Syria, telling me this in terms, kind of shrugging. I was saying, you know, what the hell are you doing basically? Why aren't you stopping this war? And he said, well, until Russia and America agree to stop it, then there's really nothing I can do. And this is a kind of classical, in fact, if you like to call it that, a classical way of looking at war and conflict and diplomacy, that until the big powers agree and, you know, agree what to do in places like the UN Security Council, and if we can agree, produce bits of paper which iterate these agreements and turn them into something like order, certainly turn them into rules and laws, then conflicts like Syria will continue. I was in eastern Syria in the Kurdish-controlled areas, and I saw something that changed my mind about that. I saw bottom-up attempts to create peace where the Kurds, influenced by extraordinarily an American anarchist thinker called Murray Bookchin, were building inclusive participatory democracy, which would include Arabs, Turkmens, Assyrians, the non-Kurdish minorities, in the belief that this was the best way to create peace in Syria. Now, I'm oversimplifying a highly complicated situation, but the point I'm trying to make is that I think increasingly, when we look at problems like climate change, financial disorder, inequality, but certainly conflict, in the 21st century, the idea that we can arbitrate these conflicts from little rooms in New York on the East River and produce meaningful agreements that actually help end these conflicts, I think that is not working. And I think to rely on that model is to make a category mistake about the kind of world that we're looking at, which is where these phenomena are supranational, they are non-state, they are complex, they are multi-actor, where the actors are not just states, they are billions of people. You look at the big problems that worry us today, things like financial volatility, the influence of Chinese property prices on the prospects of employment in America, or ISIS, which is this horrifying and terrifying non-state phenomenon, or climate change. The list is a long one. And then you look at the attempts of governments to make rules to arbitrate those things, and it's what you see is not terribly compelling. Anyway, that's kind of the point I wanted to leave you with. It's a debating point, it's not an unassailable truth, but it is certainly something I have increasingly seen, and having sat in the Security Council making those rules over and over again about places, about war in the Middle East, but also about places like Kosovo and Afghanistan, and I've now attended the UN Security Council in 5 different delegations. I can't help but feel that that place is not the place that's going to produce order and justice in our world by any means, and in fact I think it's producing rather the opposite. Anyway, that's just the UN Security Council. One can apply the critique more broadly, but about those other institutions I know less. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for listening. I look forward to our discussion.
So I think we're going to open the floor to questions.
Yes.
What's the alternative?
What's the alternative?
I mean, we have an international order in place. It's like, and the international community works with the tools it has, which are limited, as you correctly pointed out. But where do we go? It's like there's been a lot of discussion about reforming the Security Council.
Yeah.
Where should we go?
It's the right question, and the answer I think is complicated and and manifold. I don't think there is one answer. This is part of the problem. There are many answers, and the idea of a singular system or a singular discourse or way of thinking to govern and arbitrate these problems is a mistake. Clearly, we're not going to abolish the state-based order. Clearly, it has its role, in negotiating and arbitrating what it can. I would not abolish the UN Security Council, even though I despise it as an institution, because at least they flipping well talk in there, and the Russians and the Americans and others actually have meaningful discussions about the way of the world and things that are going wrong. But to take conflict as an example, which you could then use as an analogy for other supranational globalized problems, I think you have to accept that conflict has become multi-party, that you need to include all parties in these processes, that it is absurd to discuss Syria without including all the parties in some way. I'm not saying you should invite, al-Nusra and ISIS to sit around a table in New York with a nameplate in front of them and deliver a statement to the UN Security Council, but you need to talk to them, and you need to have some process that doesn't legitimize them, but accepts that in order to have peace, you are going to have to talk to them. And this isn't some, track 2 diplomat or NGO official having a private discussion in a Geneva hotel. I don't mean that. I mean that the world needs to accept that wars like Syria are not fixed informal talks between the opposition and the government. And there are multiple conflicts where that same lesson applies. I think the UN itself needs to be radically reformed, and by that I don't mean enlarging the Security Council to have more permanent members. I think that would be a nightmare. In a completely different way. It would actually just kind of remodel all the mistakes of the 20th century for the 21st. And when I mean change it, I mean make it transparent, make those affected able to address it, make the countries who are actually, for instance, taking part in peacekeeping operations consulted on the decisions of the Council, make the staff of the UN much more meritocratic, change the appointment of the Secretary General. There's a whole host of things which are actually totally doable, or actually much more doable than changing the veto and expanding the number of the Security Council members. But I do actually think that, coming from the world and living in that world of diplomacy, I'm appalled by how closed it is, that diplomats talk to each other about these places, and because we're now so overwhelmed with process, if you're a European diplomat, you're spending your entire time going from summit to working group to summit to meeting, sitting in business class lounges. You're not actually there where these problems are occurring. And, my life has taught me that unless you actually listen to the people there, you're not even going to start solving it. If you sit in New York dealing with pictures of the world and pretending you understand it when you basically know nothing, as I did, I knew nothing about Iraq when I was our Iraq expert at the UN Security Council, you're not going to fix these things. That's a start. But also I think accepting that states will not do it. You know, that is a painful acceptance because it means, crikey, are we going to have chaos? No, it doesn't mean we're going to have chaos. It means that the rest of us have to carry a different kind of burden, that we have to accept that we are responsible as much as our governments are, and just appealing to governments to fix these problems is utterly naive. That's a start. It's not the whole answer by any means. So,
Carne, it would seem that Iraqi Kurdistan, I mean, it's basically been semi-autonomous for a fairly long time,
yeah.
might be a candidate for a kind of Kosovo strategy, and I wonder if you talked to them. You just mentioned you were at least dealing with Kurds.
Yeah.
I mean, they've got their own flag, their own airline.
Yeah. Well, I'm very pro-Kurdish, but I'm not, you know, I wouldn't separate the Iraqi Kurds out from the others, to be honest. I'm very pro-Syrian Kurds because I've just spent some time with them and was incredibly impressed with them. And frankly, much more impressed with them than with the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq, which is pretty corrupt and dominated by this, you know, rather awful man, Barzani, who's a kind of petty dictator in democratic clothes, who was turning on his own Kurdish brothers and sisters just to keep the Turks sweet so that he can export oil out through Turkey, which is his vision of autonomy and independence, which is basically taking a slice of the oil pie from Iraq and making it mine. That's not a vision of independence I particularly find appealing. I have talked to them. I've said these things to them in slightly politer terms. You know, I think, personally, I think the solution for Syria is in a deeply decentralized confederal Syria, if you want to call it that, where there will be an autonomous Kurdish area. And the same, frankly, for Turkey. What is extraordinary in southeast Turkey is that this idea of bottom-up government, the Bukchanite ideas of self-government, is actually being implemented in southeast Turkey too. And this is one of the reasons Erdogan is so discomforted by the Kurds and the ideological connection between the Turkish Kurds and the Syrian Kurds, which interestingly the Iraqi Kurds are completely separate from. Ideologically, they're in this little world of the KDP and the PUK, and not really connected with what is going on in Turkey and Syria, and indeed Iran, which also has some ideological connections with the Turkish Kurds and the Syrian Kurds. Hopelessly complicated. I would be very sorry if the KRG alone became independent. I also don't think it's going to happen, because the Americans don't want it to happen, and they've told the KRG to shut up about it. And as long as the KRG is ultimately dependent on the US for its security, which it is, I don't think they're going to do it. And Barzani's kind of getting what he wants. I mean, I was up in Erbil a couple of months ago, and they're building huge palaces and kind of houses of government. It's pretty sick. So he's got his little fiefdom. Yes?
Earlier you mentioned, with regards to bringing everyone together to sort of speak, there was a fear of legitimizing certain groups.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, can you explain why are we afraid to legitimize groups that otherwise seem legitimate, even if we, you know, don't like what they're doing?
Yeah. Well, I don't have that fear. So I wouldn't include we, and I suspect you don't include yourself in we either, from the nature of the question. No, we as states. They don't like legitimizing people who are not states because it's very threatening to them. This is why states are intrinsically against new states. So, I mean, I was involved in South Sudan, Kosovo, I'm involved in Western Sahara, Somaliland, you know, talking to the Kurds. Self-determination is kind of my thing. And in every case, the international community is against it, at least initially. Oh, Catalonia, I've just been advising Catalonia as well. And the international community, or Intercom as Noam Chomsky calls it, is deeply hostile to that too. Even though in Somaliland you have a majority of people in Somaliland who have repeatedly said they want to be their own country. Oh no, we ignore democracy, international law is more important. I've had Norwegian ministers say to me, I say Somaliland should be independent, it's been governed independently since 1991. Well, why don't you let it be independent? Its people have overwhelmingly voted for independence. Oh, because that's not what law says. Okay, so you're putting law before democratic wishes. Governments hate non-state actors. They want to pretend they're in charge of the world. So legitimizing them is giving them a seat at the table and giving them a little placard that makes them look a bit like states. The other more serious concern about legitimacy, because I don't respect that one at all, that's just bullshit. Legitimacy to me is from democratic support. You're legitimate if you speak for people, or if you are a person speaking for yourself. Violence doesn't give you legitimacy. And I think this question of legitimacy needs to be thought about carefully. We need to develop criteria for what is legitimate and what is not. One of the tragic experiences I have is the Polisario said to me, we have done what the international community wanted. We have respected international law. We've waited for the Security Council resolutions to be implemented. We have not gone back to war. And what has it done for us? Nothing. And I remember a representative of the Polisario saying to a representative of the SPLA of South Sudan, why are you getting your referendum and we didn't? And he said, it's simple, because we said we'd go back to the war the next day if we didn't get it. You know, blood talks. And if I was advising the Polisario, I'd say go back to war, that will get you attention. And I'd be happy to help you if you did. It's not good. You know, we legitimise violence by paying it attention and not giving truly legitimate people the time they deserve. You know, we are part of the problem here. The way we think about arbitrating disputes, who we talk to, who we think has a place at the table is part of the problem. Yes?
Yeah, on the question of legitimacy here, in fact, a very hard case here is ISIL itself.
Yes.
I can imagine if things sort of progress as they are right now, nothing much, boundaries don't change very much, but there were the people who are in power, and as long as they can stay out of the way of the these drones, that they can do that. Say for a few years, they will have established a presence. At what point does the issue of legitimacy apply to them? Now, we don't like what they do. They have single-minded ideas about religion and religious beliefs, and who are good people and who are not. But could you imagine giving advice, political advice, to an organization like that, particularly when it claims it has its presence in several different states?
Yeah.
And but just where does the legitimacy, this issue of legitimacy, come down there from the standpoint of the fact that they might hang around for a while and represent some people?
It's a terribly important and difficult question. I don't have a straightforward answer to it. I mean, one part of the question, would I advise them? No, I wouldn't. You know, when I started Independent Diplomat, I did think everybody deserved advice because everybody should be heard in diplomatic process if those diplomatic processes are going to be effective. And I still think, for instance, I'd be happy to have Hamas talk to the UN Security Council. It is absurd that the world doesn't talk to Hamas. For instance, Hezbollah, the same thing. I don't like Hamas and Hezbollah, but they represent a certain view which needs to be heard. And until you hear that view, you're going to have a war. ISIS is a kind of different thing. I mean, Hezbollah and Hamas believe in a political solution to an extent, not one we particularly believe in, but ISIS is a whole different kettle of fish. But mark my words, we will talk to them, and we'll talk. They will become legitimate the day we decide we've had enough of fighting them, and that day will come, and then they will be talked to. Every one of these conflicts, we start off by calling them terrorists, and then eventually we talk to them. We talk to the Taliban, you know, we've been talking to the Taliban for like 6 years. Good story for you. The US government asked us to advise the Taliban. The US government. I said, if we do that, you're going to give me full cover. I want a piece of paper from you saying we'll never be prosecuted. But actually the reason we didn't do it is because non-profit law in the US prevents you working with listed entities. You know, the US government wanted us to do it because they felt the Taliban was negotiating so badly that they actually needed help to negotiate their interests better so the US could have an agreement with the Taliban to end the war. Isn't that perverse? I mean, the world's crazy. But we start by calling them terrorists, and then we end up negotiating with them, and we will with ISIS sooner or later, I'm sorry to say. I'd love it if we could bomb them into oblivion. I'd be delighted, but I don't think it's going to work, and I think it's just making it worse. Yes?
Sort of an open-ended question about the Lockerbie bombing, because it sounds like you were involved with investigating that, and recently we've had this amazing Frontline documentary.
Amazing.
Which I'll admit I haven't watched part 3 of it, and that's why my question is open-ended. But I was wondering kind of if you thought that there was if this is precedent setting or something, if maybe the serialization of international affairs, especially to do with terrorism, and I'm using serial in the sense of the American podcast, I don't know.
Oh, yeah. No, I get your point.
Maybe this is sort of badgers, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or if that sets any kind of new
No, I mean, I don't think it does. I think it's an extraordinary story. It's well written up in a New Yorker article, actually, which tells the whole story without you having to watch the frontline documentaries. No, it's remarkable, and I give great credit to that guy. I was actually very reassured by it because we were very involved. I mean, I was very involved in getting these two people to trial, one of whom was eventually convicted in a Scottish court that was held in The Hague, this absurd kind of hybrid mess that was the political compromise that we ultimately very reluctantly agreed to because we were losing the diplomatic battle to get the two to trial in Scotland, because people like Nelson Mandela, who had this weird relationship with Gaddafi, were arguing that this was somehow unfair that they would be tried in Scotland. Anyway, so the compromise was they were tried in The Hague, and one of the, I mean, it's a long story, but I'll try and be brief. One of the parents of one of the people who was killed had begun to argue very vociferously and quite compellingly that the two Libyans were not responsible, that another group, perhaps the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, which is backed by Iran, had been responsible. And it all goes back to the origin of particular timers that were made by this ghastly Swiss man who sold a bunch of timers to Libya and Iran and others, who then passed them on to terrorist groups. Anyway, so doubts have begun to form in my mind about it, because the indictment and the case against the two guys was a hell of a chain of evidence, a hell of a chain. And one of the links in that chain was a Maltese shopkeeper recognizing one of them from buying a pair of trousers that had ended up in the suitcase where the bomb was. So that was the kind of evidence we were talking about. And, you know, when I thought about it, I thought, bloody hell, we've gone to all of this trouble for nothing and we've got the wrong people. You know, maybe this is some kind of, I didn't really know. But actually this guy's proved that it was Libya all along. He's found two people who were basically the masters of the two people who were tried, both of whom are now dead. But these two people he identified as still alive, and in theory could be tried. So kudos to him. I think it's fantastic. I think it's fantastic, and it's actually solved, really laid to rest a huge international controversy about who did it, and a mystery as well. You know, I don't think it's the serialization of it. I don't think, you know, I think this has always had its place. Governments aren't omniscient, let alone omnipotent. You know, they're basically incompetent. They basically don't really know what they're doing. There are bits of it that are super good, and the cops are often actually a good part of it because they've got a highly professionalized discourse and practice and professionalism in some ways, not in all. But diplomats are not. They're basically, you know, making it up as they go along. When you see diplomats talking about things like the Iran deal or nuclear weapons or climate change, you know, they're basically reading off a brief that they barely understand, because I used to write those briefs. And I'm afraid that's the truth. You know, I was one of the few people who understood WMD in Iraq. It's a complicated picture, but I was one of about 4 people in my entire government who could actually explain how Scud missiles were related to biological weapons, to CW, what certain types of CW meant, what the significance of various special weapons regiments were in Iraq, etc., etc. Literally about 4 people in my government who could do that. So when Tony Blair or some other senior pompous person stands up and says, this is going on, and this is going on, and you have plenty of them in your government, just ignore them. They don't know what they're talking about. That's what I learned.
Good too.
Yeah. That's why I'm an anarchist. Seriously. They don't know what they're doing. They pretend that they do, but they don't. Anyway.
What kind of leverage you consider ID have in influencing all the countries or even the non-state actors in terms of the issues you are solving on behalf of your clients? I mean, you consider yourself as NGO, and
Yeah.
what kind of difference between you and a think tank and, you know, and
Yeah.
even consulting firm and I know
Well, you know, for me it's never been an NGO, and I don't like the term because it's, when I was a diplomat I despised NGOs. I was like, you're nothing, we run the world. Really, I was that arrogant. I'm pretty arrogant now, but I was that arrogant from a government point of view. I despised the NGOs. I thought, you do not know what you're talking about. We know the truth. We're governments. We have your security at heart. I honestly believe this. And you're surrounded by people who also believe it, who constantly reaffirm that belief. So for me, independent diplomat is a political cause, and when I talk about the Syrians, or I talk about the Kurds, or I talk about the Sahrawis and Western Sahara, it's there. You know, I'm not doing this as just a job. I wouldn't do it otherwise because it's too hard and it's too difficult, and, you know. But one of the things I've learned, which is really inspiring actually, is that if you're really determined and you're really dedicated, you can make a difference. You know, I don't talk about us, but I talk about the people we work with. On this Sri Lanka thing, the US government was lobbied by a group called the US Tamil Political Action Council. There's a small group of Tamils, many of whom lost relatives in the war. You know, not people American politicians frankly take very seriously. But they built up a dialogue with the State Department of extraordinarily seriousness and professionalism. And to the credit of the State Department, they were partners in that dialogue. And as a result, the US took a really positive, important position in the Human Rights Council and contributed to the result that we've seen today. And that was a small group of people. It wasn't, 500,000 people sending in a petition or an email or whatever. It was a really small group of about 6 people who did it. I mean, it really taught me something. So that gives me hope. I don't think that the world is made by these immutable geopolitical forces and that we are just kind of little atoms. I really don't think that. I think actually we have extraordinary power if only we'd use it. What I despise is the people who just lie back and let it roll over them. Because you don't have to. You can stop these things. You can change things. And that I really believe because I see it. And it's not us, it's the people we work with. Yes?
In regards to climate change, and you talked about the limitations of enforcement, what do you think are good incentives or consequences to hold nations accountable to their emissions caps?
Well, they never will be accountable because nations will not accept that their sovereign right to make economic policy should be subsumed to international obligations such as the Climate Change Treaty. And only in very rare cases have states seriously agreed to treaties that would bring them potential sanctions for breaching those treaties. The European Union is an example of it, where there are clear sanctions for breaking certain EU rules, which the member states of the EU have signed up to. There are certain trade agreements that have similar qualities. But on something like carbon emissions, which, for good or ill, is about the whole way you run an economy. It's about your energy policy, which is huge. It's about, it's a massive thing. It's also an ideological thing. I think the chances of countries agreeing to accept potential sanctions is of course very low. I mean, the US rejects that because the US, it's not just Republicans. The US has a different view of its sovereign status in the world than an EU country. Interestingly, EU countries had already signed up to binding emissions targets under the EU, which are much higher than those they're required to do under the UNFCCC. So that's an example. It's differing views of sovereignty, and unfortunately we live in a world where a lot of countries still think that their sovereign wishes are supreme over everything, including the right to go to war. We have inherited an ideology, and it's only an ideology, it's not a truth, that the states have the right to go to war under certain circumstances. I don't accept that right. I don't think anybody has the right to use violence in any circumstance except self-defense. But states have given themselves that right. And I think states should adhere to certain basic rules, human rights. Carbon emissions might be another one, but they won't. And so therefore we have to look at alternatives.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have to leave as there's a class coming in here shortly.
Yes.
This is kind of piggybacking off of the answer you just gave, talking about how in the EU they are more effective, in some ways more effective at, setting these standards and then enforcing compliance.
Yeah.
So do you think that we would be more effective at combating these kind of global ills at the regional level rather than at the international level? Or do you think that these regional organizations like the AU, like the EU, would just kind of still face the same issues that the UN does?
Well, I set the EU apart from all other regional organisations, and I wouldn't use it as an example from which you can generalise about regional organisations, because it is completely different from the AU, ASEAN, all others. The Association of America, you know, whatever. It's completely different. It's philosophically completely different, legally, in regulatory terms. It's a unique thing at the moment. And yes, I think it has been remarkably effective in dealing with some of these problems. But, you know, this is not an easy thing. You know, we've seen extraordinary strain put upon the EU. Refugees now, there's no agreement inside the EU about how to deal with it, but also Greece. The financial crisis put an incredible strain on the EU. And I think it's an open question where the EU will go from now. When I was younger, I thought the EU was on a kind of ineffable, unstoppable path towards greater integration and solidity, and now I don't. I think there's a real possibility that Britain will leave, for instance, which would be a pity. But I also think that that time has passed, unfortunately. I think that moment for regional integration dealing with these problems, the Europeans exploited an extraordinary moment in economic and political history that was available. And I don't think that actually that's available anymore, because I think regional organisations are not themselves able to arbitrate the forces that they are most concerned about, if I can put it like that. Be they migration flows or climate change or the new kinds of security threats that we face. I think it's an interesting thing to ponder about. So I don't think regional organisations are per se the answer, and I think the EU is struggling itself to present itself as the answer to what Europeans want. You know, the far right is rising in Europe for a reason.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.